Okay, it's 5:31, and let's call the City Council work session meeting to order. It is Tuesday, October 7th, 2025, and ask our clerk Sharon Allison to call the roll.
Councilmember Agnew. Here. Councilmember Jackson. Here. Councilmember Pierce.
Here.
Councilmember Risser.
Here.
Mayor Hovland.
Here. We've got a singular topic this evening, this utility rate study update that we're going to go through, and I guess at the end of the day, we think about how many capital improvement projects we want to undertake at one time or over time.
Yep.
So here we go. I'll let you roll it out. We've got Manager Neil,
Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Engineering Director Chad Miller, Paul Tower, our Finance Director, and Nick Anhut, our Senior Municipal Advisor from Ellers, here with us, just for the record. So, okay.
Our presentation to you tonight at work session is all about utilities, utility projects in our water, sewer, and waste and storm sewer utilities, and also the underlying rate structure that we are looking at in terms of providing funding to do those projects. So, in terms of the presentation tonight, we want to start with the actual projects themselves, the proposed capital investments, and then we'll go from there to the money part. So, if we could. We've got a lot of content to get to you tonight, and we've tried to put this together to reserve a sufficient amount, we hope a sufficient amount of time for you to have dialogue as well. So, Chad.
Okay, so just wanted to get into some of the bigger projects that we've been considering for many years that are now somewhere in the past rate study. Now this is an update to those rate studies. So the first one, if you recall, the Trunk York Avenue trunk sewer improvements. We've been working on this. We've completed 3 phases. They're completing the 3rd phase right now. That project will be complete in about a month. Areas 4, 5, 6, and 7, or Hazelton Road and West 69th, are still in the capital improvement plan as part of this rate study. So just a reminder, we continue to upsize the sanitary sewer to support development within this area. This project's unique is that there's been developments basically paying for these upgrades as it happens because of the SAC and WAC fees that happen. So this one is kind of funding as we go with the development that's happened within this area the last 10 years or so. And these costs were, again, historical costs, but just showing you the different stages and where we're at. So these other 4 stages are programmed in the CIP. The other big one that we put in during the last CIP was the South Trunk. We've also called it the Cahill sanitary sewer improvements. This goes between and under France Avenue on the east and High 100 on the west. This opens up potential development in the Cahill Industrial Park area. We've had a few developers come through and ask to densify some properties, and we've had to say no, we don't have capacity. So this was a priority of the council a few years ago. We did an initial study probably 5 years ago, put it in the capital plan. Now we're actually in the design and consideration of how we actually do it, because the pipe is very deep, going right through a neighborhood. That report will be completed soon. We did promise the neighbors on 72nd Street that we're going to do that first phase next year. That's where a lot of the traffic calming and some of that stuff, you've got a lot of emails on that. So we're working through that design. That'll come in front of you during that December special council meeting for assessments, because there is a small portion of this project assessed on 72nd Street. So that's the opportunity for its residents to speak on those traffic calming issues that they have on 72nd. This study recently updated those costs. So you see $60 million in the capital plan, and we're spreading it out over 10 years. So if we do have developers yet, it's still going to be 10 years before we unlock that area of town for development. So just keep that in mind. Lincoln Londonderry, you recently approved a small area plan for this area. It is not included in this rate study. So we wanted to make that clear that that is not in here. We felt like that could be a future discussion with the comprehensive plan. If there's any ideas of densifying along Vernon, that would also be supported by this infrastructure, but that red line follows pretty much 9 Mile Creek. It's a $20 to $40 million project if we want to do it along our own corridor. There is an opportunity to go into Minnetonka with just a very small portion of that area. So just wanted to make sure the council understood that this is not included in the rate study. Now switching over onto the water fund, we've had this discussion and recently approved Yorktown Park, or where the location of the old fire station number 2 is for water treatment plant number 5. So we kind of have the layout and the size. We have 2 wells that are already plumbed for this, and we updated those estimated costs in 2025 at $31.5 million. So that's included in the rate study. From a schedule standpoint, early 26, we demo that existing facility. In 26, Parks will be doing a Yorktown Park master plan. That's in the CIP. So then design would follow after that master planning process to see how we integrate that plan with the treatment plant in 27, 28, year to two design. Construction 28 to 30, kind of left that open yet to see how those other markers are met with the master plan and design. Then the other big one, this is probably the big one that will have most discussion because it's got the most impact on rates tonight when you see those numbers, but it's the flood risk reduction strategy. So in the 2028 comprehensive plan, included in there was the water resources management plan. And that included a commitment to develop this flood risk reduction strategy. Ross managed that task force, and they've met over a course of a year in 2019. And then in 2020, the council adopted that strategy. And in 22, we amended that water resources management plan with incorporating in the flood risk reduction strategy. And this is just what that strategy states, right? Reducing risk throughout the community. And you can do that in a variety of methods, whether it's infrastructure, regulation, outreach and engagement, or the emergency services. And our first project, which is complete, was the Morningside. That was our first flood risk reduction project. It was a great outcome on that. And then we threw in 5, 6 other big projects we knew of, and we kind of stacked it on the end of the CIP that was developed a couple years ago. So we really put a lot of placeholders in 2030, 2031. I think there might be some discussions tonight if that's the right schedule based on the rates you're seeing, because if we push some of those projects, then the rates would change accordingly there. But these are the areas we identified. The adaptive level control, some of that it's on your agenda tonight to start design for that one. And Concord flood, we've been working with the school district to do a cooperative project right down here at Concord. So they actually did tennis courts already without a watershed permit, with the understanding that they might cooperate with us on this cooperative project, because we want to put some underground facilities underneath their ball fields and make it better for both parties. So I think those two are kind of moving forward, and then the last 3 are ones that we could discuss on what is the appropriate timing with those. So I think now we hand it over to Nick.
Thank you. All right, so I'll dive into the financial side of things. So we've conducted routine utility rate studies for the city over the course of, sometimes every other year, sometimes spaced out a little bit further. But really, it's usually driven by updates to the CIP, right? So capital tends to be the largest ticket item that we're solving for in these studies. And this slide is really just trying to provide a reminder that these are enterprise funds, so they're different from governmental funds, and that the expectation is that they're paying for themselves. So the fees and charges that the council imposes through its ordinance and the way it structures those are intended to cover all of the operating as well as capital costs, any debt, or any other expense of maintaining and updating these systems. And we analyzed individually the water, the sewer, and the stormwater systems. Each are a little bit different, but they are built together quarterly. So the payers tend to be the same types of folks. Some might vary depending on how much they are using, but ultimately we evaluated each one of these kind of separately as their own standalone item, with the intent that the charges imposed for each one, so water fees would pay for water and the capital expenditures of those, sewer would pay for sewer, storm for storm. Your audit combines these all into one category called your utilities, but they are accounted for in 3 different separate accounts. I gotta run both at the same time. How the city charges, this has changed and morphed over time, but some items are fairly consistent. So the city ordinance for water imposes a base fee. So this is a fixed fee. It does not change during the course of the year. It is updated within your fee schedule from time to time if those fees need to be adjusted, but it is a fixed fee that is applied to each meter, essentially. So if an account has 1 meter, they pay 1 fixed charge associated with that. Fixed fee is intended to cover fixed costs, right? So these would be costs that are going to happen more or less regardless of how much an individual consumer is actually using. So things like billings, the software, personnel costs, some supplies, some parts of the system themselves are not necessarily going to change or need to grow over time based on how much consumption is actually taking place. It's more based on how many accounts are being administered and how many different users there are. Different from a base fee, there's what is termed volumetric charges. So this would be basically usage, right? So how many gallons are actually being used by the individual consumer. It is charged per 1,000 gallons in your ordinance, and the charges are tiered in such a way so that some minimal amount of use, the first tier, is charged at one rate, and then the charge jumps up once that is eclipsed, and any usage beyond that first threshold gets charged at a higher rate. And there is even another tier on top of that for a higher rate, and this is called a conservation pricing method. Essentially, you're tiering the charges to incentivize consumers to potentially reduce their use, or at least if they're price sensitive, they will potentially reduce some of their use and reduce the stress that puts on the system and the potential for consumption beyond the capacity of the system. Sanitary sewer is a use charge entirely, but it's got kind of a hybrid to deliver some fixed amount of revenue. It is charged for residential users based on the lesser of the winter quarter use. So winter quarter falling between December and April of each year, well, through March. And this would be typically when the lowest amount of water is used, and typically when all of that water might be going down the drain, as opposed to in other times of the year when there might be outdoor or other types of use where that water is not actually going down the drain through the sewer system. It's actually either being absorbed within the property itself or might find its way into the storm drain. In that system, again, we're charging stormwater fees to cover that expense. So this minimum fee is basically designed so that the user is charging the lesser of either their winter quarter use for each quarter throughout the year, or their actual, in the case that maybe they used a lot during the winter and then didn't use as much in the summertime, being out of town or whatever the case may be. But this is charged at a minimum of 8,000 gallons for each user. So their use up to 8,000 gallons, they're going to pay for, no matter what. Any use beyond that in their winter quarter, they would pay for that on a 1,000-gallon basis per the rate. But essentially, it's a hybrid to ensure that we do have some amount of fixed costs associated and fixed revenues to cover those fixed costs, but it does fluctuate if there is usage beyond that category. And that was a change that was imposed in 2023. The minimum used to be 12,000 gallons, and it used to be only the winter quarter solely. We did not allow for the lesser of mechanism, and that council decided to make that change in reaction to some complaints from some users that maybe we weren't using as much in other quarters during the year. And for the majority of other users, non-residential users, a lot of their sewer is actually metered and tracked. So they'll actually be charged based on what's actually going down the drain. Residential users don't typically have a separate meter that's measuring the flow that's going down the drain as opposed to what's coming in through the water system. So this is a way of dealing with the reality of the fact that we don't have necessarily perfect information, but we do have some indication that winter use should be generally essential use, and that's the mechanism that is used. Stormwater is a single rate that is adjusted based on the property use. So a single family use would pay a set fee or a charge per quarter, And then other types of uses would adjust from that based on what's called a residential equivalency factor. And this has to do with, you know, how intense the usage of the property is in terms of potential impervious surface and what would actually go out into the storm system. So, you know, a typical residential use is going to have grass and other things that are going to absorb some of the rainwater as well as some of the irrigation. That's not going to go down the storm drain in all cases, but maybe a pure, you know, concrete parking lot is going to have everything 100% go down the drain. So that residential equivalency factor allows for some kind of mechanism to differentiate, you know, the property that might be putting more strain on the system versus others. And so that's how the city's ordinance charges for those. There are some other fees and revenues associated with it. There's you know, billing and other types of things, but those are the main categories. There's also connection fees for the water and sewer system. And these are based on development, new development. So if we are going to intensify the use of a property, turn a single-family home into a, you know, a duplex or a quad or even maybe even a larger multifamily building, that's going to now induce more use, more consumption, and take on a greater responsibility and put more strain on the system potentially. And so there are some connection fees that are paid, you know, once the permit essentially is pulled to build those developments or redevelopments. So if you have a redevelopment that, you know, is a renovation of an existing home and you're still gonna be using it as a single family home, you're not charged a SAC or WAC fee. But if you are adding new units, then those new units are charged on the basis of adding a new user or capacity to the system. So these are all the different various mechanisms and revenue sources within your existing structure. When we look at a utility rate study, we're primarily focused, we're financial folks. We're really looking at the money, right? And whether or not we're gonna be able to continue to maintain these funds so that they are self-sufficient and they're not drawing on other resources of the community. They're not drawing on resources from one another, and they're not drawing on the need to maybe even use property taxes or other types of revenues to pay for, again, the operation and capital costs of the system. So that's our primary objective. But when we do this analysis, we're also able to look at, you know, usage patterns, determine whether or not the fee structure looks like it's equitable. We're able to inform if there's a particular goal or a policy objective, a change in policy that the council wants to promote. We can use some of that usage information to help provide a backbone or a backing of that goal or analysis, and maybe changing the way these charges are. Ultimately, the charges are essentially allocating the cost of the system to different users based on their habits or how much strain they're putting on the system. But it is also a forward-looking analysis. So we are looking ahead into the future, and we're trying to solve for, you know, really the CIP and the costs that are going to be coming down the road to either add capacity to the system, to facilitate new development, redevelopment, and repairing and replacing the existing infrastructure that's in place so that it is functioning well for the community. This is just a recap of the last time that we did this analysis. So there was a study that was performed in 2021 and 2022. It kind of straddled both of those years. And again, the impetus for that was primarily the CIP. There was an update to the capital plan. Looking, you know, your capital plan that you adopt as a policy is usually 5 years. We tend to look a little bit longer term in these analyses to make sure that we're kind of getting ahead of the curve. So we use a 10-year time horizon, but this just gives you a snapshot of, well, I guess I'm not even there. I went ahead, sorry. This gives you a snapshot of some of the costs that we were trying to solve for in that analysis, and ultimately the recommendations were to inform incremental rate increases within the water fund of 5% per year, incremental increases within the sewer fund of 6% per year, and then the storm fund, again, anticipating some of these items that you have already started within the CIP and will continue, was higher at an 8% clip. That analysis also informed imposing a conservation tier structure that I described. And that was adopted and put in place to set a tier structure for residential, commercial users to try to incentivize and provide a pricing mechanism to incentivize conservation within those different categories. Again, the impetus for that was to try to curtail future growth to some degree, but also to make sure that the folks that are using the system are paying for it. And so the city already had tiers put in place, but the tier bands, or the amount of gallons within those tiers were much wider than was recommended, and didn't necessarily reflect the kind of the indoor essential use versus the kind of more discretionary type of use. And so a lot of the users within the system, particularly in the residential, were, all of their use was falling within that lower category, and they weren't getting any of the pricing influence of beyond that first tier. But you did have a 3-tier system in place at that point in time. I should also mention that there are also irrigation specific accounts for certain users. So this is not every user, but these are a separate meter that measures just the outdoor irrigation use. And this is fairly typical for businesses, homeowners associations, multifamily buildings, larger properties with a lot of external area and a way for them to be able to control and have their finger on the dial for exactly how much they're potentially using and consuming. So you do have an irrigation charge as well on top of the residential, commercial, and multifamily. But those users might straddle any one of those different categories, but they have a separate irrigation meter that's measuring that. It's not typical for a single family home to have a separate meter that's measuring just what they're using for their lawn. But this would be big sprinkler systems and things like that.
Question
Yeah,
with
good.
that. Okay, so however, the data is being collected during the winter, correct?
So we measure the entire year, but every year the winter use is measured and then used as a kind of a baseline for the sewer charges.
Why do we do that? Why don't we do the summer when the usage is higher?
I think the idea is to try to make sure that we're really only, because we're setting a minimum, right?
Okay.
The minimum is intended to deliver enough revenue to support all the fixed and variable costs of the system that's necessary. And when we set a minimum, we want to make sure that we're not being extra punitive to users that might be using much less than that minimum threshold. And they might be doing so just for their everyday important drinking water, bathing, things like that, those things going down the drain. Whereas if we were measuring based off of, summer usage for a property, a lot of their use might not be going down the drain, and we don't have a way to measure what's actually going down the drain. So if we measured a property in the summer when they have their sprinklers on, that water might be shooting out into the yard, getting absorbed within the grass. None of it's going down the drain. And so we don't want to set a minimum that everyone's paying for based on potentially use that's not actually feeding into our system and needs, water that doesn't need to be cleaned up.
Okay, but the value of the water coming out of the system and the aquifer and all of that
There is no minimum charge for the water that's coming
Okay.
into the house. That's the tiers that I mentioned. The minimum is only charged on the sewer
only on the
side of the
sewer.
equation.
Okay,
That's the minimum
okay,
that's measured in the winter.
okay, thank you.
On that 2022 study, where you've got that first bullet point, 2022 through 2031 CIP projects, are any of the projects you described at the beginning of the presentation encompassed within that need, or are they all in there? How do these numbers match up with what you showed us at the beginning of this presentation?
So some of those might have had some overlap. but very few. Most of them would have been storm.
Storm or we had the York project, the first one I kicked off, that was in there. And the self-sanitary, we had an estimate at the time, but we know much more. That number went up considerably since that initial study. The flood projects were something new that I think it was right after that last rate study.
So, there's been essentially 3 or 4 years that have lapsed, right? You've accomplished a lot of those projects already. And now everything that Chad mentioned, the majority of those, other than I think the first slide, were forward-looking, looking ahead into the future needs.
Yeah, like the water treatment plant was in here, but it was a much different number. So we updated numbers on some projects, some were included and some were not.
So if I look back at the first part of the presentation, it looks like excluding the flood risk reduction projects, there's about 150 million worth of projects you're thinking about.
Yeah, and I think Nick will probably get into those details yet if we want to get through the
Okay,
slides,
all right, okay.
Overall details.
And so I take it that in 22, go back to the prior slide, please.
Sorry.
I take it that second bullet point then, it says inform future general rate increases. Those are rate increases that we did adopt based on that 2020.
That's correct.
That are in place now.
Yep, now you're gonna see the
So we're
difference.
working off that base that we established in 2022.
Correct.
That's correct. So that informed your 2025 adopted fee schedule, and it would have been informing everything going forward, except now we have new information, and that's what we're sharing with you all today. I already touched on quite a bit from this slide. Again, our analysis, we're building a forecast, right? So it's not looking backward, what we paid for, but what we're anticipating in the future. And we want to set rates at a level to deliver sufficient revenue to be able to support the debt and hopefully, cash payment to fund the CIP and all the operations of the system. So we built that based on a couple of factors that I'll get into, some of the assumptions that we use, but we want to make sure that we're covering all of the anticipated costs for each one of these utilities over that time horizon. So we did have to have an in-depth and extra discussion with Public Works and Engineering because, you can see this goes out 10 years. That's beyond the CIP. We had to think ahead, think about some more things, think about the assumed costs that would be going into those outer years and making sure that we're setting you on the right glide slope in terms of the rates that would be necessary to deliver on all of these potential needs. Now, that doesn't mean all these projects are going to come forward exactly as predicted in this analysis. So typically, what will happen when you adopt your annual fee schedule, there will be budget discussions that happen. There will be updates potentially to the CIP or projects and their timelines, their costs. And so you're able to react on an annual basis. And if there are changes that come forward in the future, you might be able to dial down the recommended increases. But we have to see how those play out. What we're doing today is trying to solve for everything in that 10-year horizon, and just give you a sense of what might be necessary. And that'll feed into some of your future budget discussions, whether or not you want to continue to do that or change it up and the like. And ultimately, we want to make sure that what revenues are coming in from the users of each one of these systems is delivering some minimum target amount of capital or cash, essentially, at the end of the year that's going to be able to support at least 4 months of operating expenses. So why 4 months? Well, we want it to last at least a quarter because we only bill quarterly. So we don't get revenue necessarily, thinking based on that quarterly analysis consistently throughout the year. So we want to make sure that we've got at least 4 months to cover some of those, and it's good just to have a reserve anyway because some expenses will fluctuate during the course of the year. We also want to make sure that we're able to cover our debt payments, and so that we don't have to draw on any other funds to, even if it's on a short-term basis, we don't want to have to loan from another fund to be able to cover a debt payment, even if we can pay it back quickly. We want these to be self-sufficient funds. So we built the target such that at the end of every year, each fund would have 100% of their next year's bond payments set aside in cash to be able to make those payments. And then we also want to set some kind of minimum reserves in the unlikely event that there's something that we're not planned for in the CIP, a line break or something of substance that requires a significant capital investment. So we want to make sure we have reserves to be able to cover for that kind of a calamity, if you will. Again, with the intent, you know, we could think about issuing debt or things like that that's paid back from the utilities to cover some of those. But, you know, in the case that, you know, we might not be able to get to it on time, there's always a chance you need to draw on some other fund, and so we want to make sure we're protecting those other funds with the minimum target that we're setting.
So the things we're trying to cover, is there anything different about the things that you've listed here than what we've done in the past?
These targets are actually fairly consistent. We have, from time to time, adjusted the potential cost of an unforeseen repair because capital, you know, things are more expensive now than they were 10 years ago. So we might adjust that, but this fundamental premise has been consistent in these analyses.
One thing, because I do keep thinking about seasons and impervious surfaces, and I know there are single-family houses where there's a lot of impervious surface, and I'm thinking about one where it looks like they've built all the way out to the lot line and are violating the, you know, that they would have 25% pervious surface because they're under 9,000 square feet.
Sure.
And so there's that. There's also the phenomenon of during the summer and even now, the sprinklers that are watering the street. And, you know, things like that are, you know, and I don't know if there's some kind of way of looking at that water usage and trying to figure out some way to capture. So I just, as a comment, wanted to get that out. I don't think we can assume that everyone is very, you know, carefully watering their tomato plant or whatever.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And things also happen on a
Right.
property. You might have a breakage or something like that. Other things happen. So. So as I mentioned, some of the assumptions we're using. So, you know, we started, we wanted to build a budget, an operating budget for each fund. So, you know, we started from what was actually incurred in '24, use that as kind of a historical benchmark. We also used the budget that was adopted for '25 already, since that was already in place. And then what's forecasted within your budget documents for these utilities. And then we added some assumptions for inflationary expenses. So we wanted to make sure that we're not, you know, assuming that, hey, everything that we budget for right now is going to stay exactly the same over the course of the next 10 years. We know that's not going to be the case. So just to be careful, we included some percentage growth of those operating and capital costs. So 3% just in general operating expense growth, 5% specifically for personnel costs. One item that I should mention right now, I had it in a previous slide, but I didn't touch on it, the Met Council environmental service charge. So everyone in the metropolitan area is part of the Metropolitan Council sewer treatment. Various facilities, very large facilities, handle all of the treatment for the entire metro area, and they charge for that treatment. Now the city of Edina needs to get that sewage out to that facility and do that through its own infrastructure, but the Met Council does impose a charge that is paid for from the sewer fund. Typically those charges, we're going to get them about 6 months in advance of the next year, and they're based on actual flow patterns. So they're charging for basically how much the total sewage from the city that goes into their treatment, and they're apportioning it amongst all the different communities that they serve. And they come up with that amount, and that's a dollar amount that we find out. Sometimes it stays relatively the same, sometimes it grows. I think this last one went up about 5.8%. Our prior analysis had assumed, you know, anywhere between 4 and 5% growth in the Met Council sewage charges. We're gonna recommend assuming a 7% growth. We're getting some indications in some of the internal Met Council discussions, and that those, you know, again, they're facing the same reality that we all are in terms of inflation and capital needs. But we wanna make sure that we're careful, since that's the largest single expense out of the sewer fund. So our study is assuming a 7% growth, which is a higher percent growth than we've assumed in the past. So that is informing quite a bit in the financial model for the sewer fund in particular. We also assume some revenue growth is gonna take place from investments and other types of, you know, non-usage fees and things like that. We also assume some connection growth. So, you know, you're redeveloping all the time, approving projects that are coming forward. But we only assumed the connection fee revenue from that growth. We did not want to model out and try to predict how a new apartment building was going to specifically add new gallons of consumption. So we did not incorporate that in the forward-looking part of the analysis. We incorporated in what we analyze right now for current usage, because we know what that actually is. But we didn't want to assume, oh, we're going to get some extra revenue coming from things that haven't actually happened yet, and development that might not occur. Certainly there's some immediate projects that might come forward, but we don't want to assume there's a 200-unit apartment building that comes online 5 years from now that nobody even has their eye on. So we did not assume, we conservatively did not include additional revenue growth tied to that specific usage in these models.
So is it fair to say these assumptions are based on what we actually spent in 24, what we budgeted for 25, 27, and then we increased that?
From there, we inflated that
Right.
based on these percentages.
Then the only revenue is the 1%.
We forecasted our budgeted revenue based on analysis of usage, actual usage. But we did not forecast that revenue would grow from new development that hasn't happened yet.
So I think it's just in general, and I get it. It's a challenge because like we don't build in any assumption of efficiencies gained. This is essentially saying every period we're gonna budget to spend more for this service.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not gonna look at, and I get why, your example of why you don't include revenue because the projects don't exist. But we also don't include, you can't use population because those structures already exist unless you're building new homes. Right, and you don't want to rely on that to figure out an allocation model either. But this ends up always being cost plus.
I think you're right, generally speaking. And I would also just want to say that when we're doing a forecast like this, we conservatively want to do that, rather than catch ourselves in the other direction. We don't want to be revenue plus. And put ourselves in a hole.
But then we're gonna
Understood.
and then we're gonna use this to allocate to residents.
That's right. So that's
Based
one of
on
the
cost
reasons our recommendations is to not try to solve it all at once in your fee schedule in 1 year, right? Because if we wanted to try to tie all this together and say, you know what, let's just bite the bullet one time. What's the amount of increase in rates that we need to solve for all of this? We're gonna see something like 50%, right? And I'm just making that up.
Yeah.
But we wanna do it incrementally over time as these actual projects are coming forward and as that new development happens, anticipating that we're gonna be doing some analysis as we go to make sure these assumptions continue to be valid. And, you some of these annual inflators, they might move the needle. The big things that are gonna move the needle are actually the CIP projects. Those are the high dollar value things that if they change, that will cause the model to give you a different conclusion. So when we do, and I don't wanna skip ahead, but we usually try to step by step, take this off 1 year at a time, allow a period of reanalysis, and then, okay, it looks like everything's following suit, let's continue down that glide path.
Yeah.
And then, if something else happens, maybe we update the analysis and put a new model together in 3 or 4 years. And that's a consistent approach that the city has typically taken in the past.
So that's why we're here tonight after having done this in 2022, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Right? And it's kind of the CIP, understanding that it's evolving, there's some new needs. And there was also just a desire to actually get in and look at some of those changes that were put in place. And that actually is a good segue to the last bullet. We also want to just see how users are using the system. I mentioned kind of the fee equity and measuring the user impacts and things like that. Those are things we can do with this analysis as well. It's not the primary objective, but it's a good way to inform whether or not you want to shift policy in the future. And so as part of this analysis, we didn't just look at the CIP and think about, all right, how much more do we need? We also looked at, let's take a sample set of a year and figure out, okay, were the assumptions that were used to set those conservation tiers, was it, are we consistently seeing the same type of patterns in the community? And, does it look like we should keep that going forward, or maybe throw it away, or think about a different approach? So we did want to make sure that we analyzed a year, 2023. That was particularly chosen because it was a drier year, not as much summer rainfall. So we could then see whether or not there was actual use from outdoor watering. 2024 was one of the wettest years that we've had in the last 20, and consumption was actually down about 17% in comparison in that year. I lost my notes. So we can look at multiple years as we go forward. If we redo this analysis again, I mean, there's a way to do that. It's kind of data intensive to keep looking at multiple years. But we did want to pick a year where there was some decent amount of watering that was taking place, and look at whether or not these tiers were set appropriately from the recommendations in 2022. This slide just shows essentially the what each fund is trying to tackle in terms of the costs and how it's apportioned between operating and capital. You can see the sanitary sewer in the middle. That's the size of the Met Council charges. That it's the largest expense of that fund. Almost 40% of the expenditures of that fund is to pay that Met Council charge. And then you can see the difference between operating versus capital. Debt would be considered a capital expense. And so in every indication, water has the most in terms of operations. About 50% of budgeted water costs are going to be for operations, but the other 50% is all capital, all the CIP items that we talked about. It's I don't want to say worse, it's not worse, it's just there's a higher degree in the other funds. They're even more capital intensive. Sorry. One other thing I wanted to note on this is just to give you some perspective. I know we talked about the last analysis, there was 60 million assumption for the water. The CIP that we're looking at right now is about 114 million for the water. So again, updated costs for the treatment plant. And these costs include not just what Chad mentioned, those were kind of the big ticket items in the preamble. But your CIP covers all, you know, equipment, it covers street reconstruction projects, all the neighborhood reconstruction that's going on, and the utility costs that are associated with that. A number of other types of expenses that are paid for under these funds. For the sewer fund, what we were trying to tackle from the CIP is about 91 million. And then for the storm sewer fund, the CIP is forecasted about 98 million over that. Again, that's out over 10 years. That's the total amount that we're trying to solve for in this analysis. Want to include a slide, connection fees. So I mentioned those. That's when things redevelop. There's a charge for the developer. They pay it when they pull the permit for adding essentially new use to the system. Last analysis suggested 3% increases per year on those connection fees, charge for water and sewer. Looking at the CIP numbers that are going forward and the projects that are specifically for expansion of capacity and not just reconstruction and some of those other things, you know, it looks like that's actually the right, that'll fund that portion of the CIP if we continue those 3% increases. So our analysis suggests that we stay on that glide path and recommend that you consider that in your fee schedule, again, per year, adjusting those fees potentially 3% per year. Sewer, on the other hand, there's more capacity projects that are forecasted within the CIP. And so we think that we should keep pace and be able to provide so that redevelopment is funding more of the CIP costs total and not just the existing user base. And so we're going to recommend a 9% per year increase in the interim to be able to fund a greater amount of capital needs within that fund. Just for some perspective, you know, the water connection fees, this is going to be very volatile because it's very dependent on what actually is being built in the community. Some years you're going to have many projects come forward. Other years you might have very few, right? Or different types that aren't going to add new users. So on average, water fees are adding about 1 million in revenue per year, and then the sewer fund about $800,000 per year.
So, yeah. I'm very worried about an upcoming recession. So if we see a halt to reconstruction, redevelopment, what does this do to our CIP? If that just doesn't happen for 10 years?
For an extended period of time?
For an extended period of time.
I would imagine.
Well, what portion of it is connection fees in your analysis, right? You could pull that out.
Yeah, we're trying to fund, again, 16.7 million of the numbers that I just quoted from before, the 90 plus.
Yeah.
And I guess the question that I would then, we would talk to, you know, do we need those projects anymore?
Yeah.
If that growth is not occurring?
Yeah, if we
And
see
we have a chance every year to look at
every
this.
year, we could,
So if this worst case scenario that I've heard a lot about in the last week of my life happens,
we can adjust.
we can adjust. So we're not stuck, we're not dependent upon this to continue to have repairs and things like that, that we can continue to have a good water system if redevelopment stops for an extended period of time.
Yeah, we can adjust based on markets. Some projects, some of this is just has to happen, repair, operations,
Right.
and street
that-
recon, you know, those things we
Right.
need to keep up. Otherwise, if we get behind, then the number just gets so big in year 10 or 20.
Well, I
So
want
we
to
wanna
sort of
balance, yeah.
servicing existing customers
Yep.
versus new
Yep.
customers kind of thing.
Yep.
So this is small enough that if the new customers drop off, we can continue to
Yep.
service existing customers.
Yep.
And we're specifically targeting those projects
Okay, that are linked to
that
redevelopment.
are linked to expansion, right?
And that's
Service and
what
growth.
This would be new customers, essentially.
This would
Yes.
be
Yeah.
development.
This is new
Development,
customers.
right?
Right,
And it-
Higher
and
density
yeah,
to your point about the revenue plus,
right.
cost plus, you know, we're not assuming that those, you know, so we're forecasting what those fees would need to be to cover their share of the CIP. We're not forecasting what their usage and those things, which would then make something like an extended recession very problematic to this analysis. So we're not assuming any of that user growth is paying for future operations and the reconstruction projects.
So, go back to that slide, please. You're making these recommendations based upon potential future development.
We are assuming we've assumed about 175 units coming online, you know, which is consistent with growth that has occurred over the last decade.
We worked with Carrie and Bill and came up with a number that we thought was reasonable over 10 years for units.
And we're not assuming, again, those 175 units are gonna be turning on the water and paying and helping offset our future revenue needs. This is only assuming that the developers, once they pull a permit, are paying this fee, and then that fee revenue will be available to cover 12 million of capital costs over the next 10 years. If that's, just trying to clarify.
That's an assumption based on past experience.
Correct.
But in your earlier part of your presentation, you said you didn't want to go to the future, you only wanted to go on what was here and knowing now.
Correct, but only for the development fees we're not making any assumption that these developed properties, these theoretical developed properties, are gonna be turning on their spigots and paying quarterly bills for their revenue use. So we have not assumed any of that in the analysis. But we have assumed that development is going to continue forward, and then what the fees need to be in order to cover the cost of growth within the community.
And then I like Member Jackson's question, if none of that happens.
Right.
Right, then we don't get those millions for construction, because this is essentially, I'm calling it new construction. That does not impact, it's more of a question, that doesn't impact the current users of the system.
Right.
Also, get, I think, why you picked 2023, because it was a dry year, there was more consumption. That's a conservative approach. But a lot of the things we're doing are built around the fact that we're getting wetter. And is that fair to our residents to be thinking about picking a dry year as opposed to what we're seeing in the trends, and what we're trying to plan for in terms of managing more water than we've ever had to manage before?
Right. We are being, as mentioned, cost plus. I think I like that description. We're assuming that, we don't want to hitch everything to a usage wagon that we don't know, that's going to fluctuate dramatically depending on a lot of different factors. And new development too tends to be more efficient in terms of its water use and utility use. So we don't want to make assumptions about what that might be as well. A lot of our existing users might be using water in a way that they wouldn't be using if it was a brand new unit with different fixtures, different property use. So we want to be very careful that we're not putting ourselves again in a hole revenue-wise, assuming growth that might not materialize. So looking at that test year 23, we want to give you some indication about kind of who pays based on consumption. So these are the volumetric charges that I mentioned. So the charges per 1,000 gallons for the commercial, multifamily, and residential classes. And it came in pretty close, not exactly for each one. They're not tied to the hilt together. They do differ, and they will differ depending on how you measure it. This is looking at the full year, 23. Residential users used 59.5% of the water, and they paid for 59.5% of the water through their volumetric charges. It wasn't exact for multifamily or commercial. They were off just a little bit. It was actually very close within this. This is just 1 year. It's going to be different. every year, depending on seasonality changes. You know, is it a wet or a dry year? You know, a dry year, you're gonna be watering your lawn quite a bit more. So then you might be paying into that higher tier consumption. Whereas a wet year, you might be watering quite a bit less and not paying into that as much. So, you know, it does fluctuate, but we wanted to give some indication of whether or not the users were paying for what they were using. And I'll go ahead.
Well, we were able to get this data because we have a new billing system, correct? That this was a billing system that was implemented like in 21 or 22, something like 23?
But we could get it before then too, because it's based off of volume.
Okay, okay.
Where are you going?
Oh, I'm just trying to remember when because it seemed to me that we had to hold off on doing the new rate structure based on usage, on getting the new rate system.
I think we didn't want to screw up the billing process,
Okay,
I think.
that
So
was
it was,
I'm just
yeah,
trying to remember
wanting to
the
get that
history of that.
system in place and up and functional before we started changing and messing with the structures
Okay.
and getting them programmed in there.
So it was just yeah, making sure it worked properly.
So yeah, so this is just a snapshot in time, but it does look like, you know, it is fairly consistent, and it's something that, you know, the council will want to look at again in the future. Every time you do an analysis like this, you know, dust it off and kind of reevaluate and make sure that it's at least in the ballpark and consistent. And again, you might want to go a different policy direction and think that one class should pay more than another. That's the direction that the council is going to have to give based on, you know, a whole host of factors that you all deal with. But the way that this was designed was to try to kind of minimize the deviation. We also look at like individual quarters, and we wanted to look at the tier structure specifically to make sure that the tiers were consistent with what was adopted. So if you recall what I mentioned, the city had a tier structure in place already. But they were wider bands. So this chart right here is just looking at the winter quarter usage during that test year in 2023. Winter quarter use, so that's going to be, generally speaking, December through March. Some customers, you know, the city uses cyclical billing. Not every customer is paying in April, in July, and, you know, you stagger them to some degree, but we're looking at basically the cold months, right? And the bills that are associated with the cold months of the year when there's not going to be expected to be that kind of outdoor irrigation use on a residential property or whatever else. You know, there's quite a bit of other activity that also takes place in the summertime that you wouldn't have necessarily in the winter that might skew it. And so this is kind of just looking at one specific example of a test to ensure that when we're setting these tiers up, that we're not being punitive to essential use, right? So what people are going to consistently be using throughout the year to prepare your food, to bathe, to flush the toilets, to do your indoor cleaning and all those other types of things. Things that you might not really be able to control. You know, even if you had perfect information and you knew exactly how many gallons you're using every minute out of the day, you might not be able to change that behavior necessarily, you know, for those types of things. We can, you know, obviously some degree, but so that's why we want to look at the winter quarter and make sure that the tiers that are imposed are applicable to the majority of that winter use, right? So the tiers that were put in place were for up to 12,000 gallons of use was charged at the lowest consumption rate. And when we look at this particular test year, this is consistent with the prior analysis. 57% of the city's residential accounts, all of their usage fell within that first tier category. So everything they were using during that 3-month period was at or below 12,000 gallons. When we expanded out to the next tier, 93% of all the accounts and usage was falling below. So only 7% of the accounts were even getting to that second tier threshold in this winter. And so what this does is it shows that yes, the tiers look like they are set in a way that kind of, I'm gonna use the word captures, that essential use, right? And so when we measure them in different months, when there's other, maybe more non-essential use that's taking place, now our tiers are going to be able to give a price mechanism for consumers to decide, maybe I don't want to use as much for those non-essential type of purposes. Maybe I can curb my usage patterns if I'm price sensitive to how much I'm paying in my bills. This type of a structure is pretty typical. There's not really a one-size-fits-all scientific, hey, this is the best practice, but generally speaking, you know, you can look at reports from Met Council, you can look at various engineering studies that are done. You're typically going to want to make sure that whatever your highest tier is, it is something that is applicable to maybe your top 10 to 20 percentile use. And then you're going to want to make sure that the other tiers, multiple tiers, fall somewhere halfway between that kind of threshold, somewhere between the 40 to 60%, to make sure, again, you're protecting, I guess, that essential kind of, you know, that use that you can't necessarily curb as easily, and then encouraging folks to conserve when they can through a price mechanism.
It's frustrating when you look at the range here, because we have people going from 2,000 gallons all the way up to 60,000. And you can say only 7% of the users are above the second tier. But in terms of the volume of water that is being used, this graph really doesn't capture just how much those households are tapping into our water sources and our resources.
Actually,
and I feel like there needs to be another tier, or, you know, something to really curb that excess use. And when I look at this winter quarter usage, I would really like to see what this summer quarter usage is, because I'm guessing the disparity is even more extreme, and that we've got a lot more households, or at least a lot more gallons of water coming out above that second tier.
Absolutely.
So I don't feel like that's encouraging conservation, because they're able to purchase it at a price. I mean, that's a lot of water. And, you know, like 60,000 gallons, what's going on there?
What's the residential profile for this data set?
Is it all single family?
This is residential users, yes, a single family, maybe, I think a duplex. That's the way your ordinance
Is
goes.
that the per unit that we're seeing these numbers?
Per account.
Per meter.
James is asking a great question. I mean, if you got a household of 5 or a household of 7.
Right.
What do you typically see?
I also wanted to, provide maybe some general information as well. So, you know, the median use in this data set for residential was 11,000 gallons. So the median was at 11,000. There are, you know, the DNR puts out some recommendations or analysis about what a typical water consumption is in the state. It's 52 gallons per person per day. If you put that in terms of Edina, right, I think the data I use showed that average household is about 2.3 people. If you extend that same 52 gallon per day per person out, that actually would be, I have it right here, 10,914 gallons. So very close to the median use. Again, winter. Now that DNR number is not winter.
But that DNR number is, you're
The DNR
calculating
number
it.
is year round. So I will throw that at you.
Edina historically has been very tending to be a community where we use a lot of water. And I don't know if that is still true, but, you know.
This would suggest that, yes.
Yes,
that
and,
is correct.
you know,
I think that's where we perform most poorly.
it is, and,
When you think about conservation things, efforts that we make around environmental,
Right.
water, we're just profligate on use of water.
but I think if we could do something and create, you know, you get up over 36,000 gallons, I mean, there needs to be, or even 32 or 30, you know, what is going on? There needs to be another, I feel like there needs to be another tier.
So I think the last thing you said is, that doesn't make sense, why? That's the question. Like, I don't know that we should have another tier or not, because I don't know the profile. Like, who's using 48,000 gallons of water and why?
There might be a variety of different reasons, right? There could be
In the wintertime, yeah.
pools, ice rinks outside,
In the winter, yeah.
So I think we need to know,
there could be
we need a little bit more data.
We do need more
is my
data.
only
a
point.
business,
Yeah.
but a
12 baths.
Big houses.
hobby.
But can we get that data so we can figure?
We've seen that summer data before.
Yeah, I do have the summer data, so I don't have a chart for you.
Talking about winter time. Who's using 60,000 gallons
Julie's
of water
question
in
is,
winter?
Julie's wondering, what is it, how bad is it
know
in
what's
the summer?
meter, but
The
you wouldn't know
reason
what
I'm showing you this slide is because we want to make sure that we're setting these tiers in a way that will cause a price indication.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But when you then turn on your outdoor use and exceed, this is winter.
So
We're
if I'm
still having
using
some that are exceeding.
60,000 gallons in the winter, when summer gets here, whatever's in that data set could double.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Or it might.
Yeah.
It might not, but yes.
Depends what
Theoretically.
they're using.
Yeah.
They're building a hockey rink in the winter and they don't irrigate, might be less.
Yeah.
But we know most
go
people
to
are using
10.
more in the summer.
Right.
But you're trying to make sure it's,
We just want to set that, if we're going to set a price mechanism,
yeah.
we want to make sure that we set it using data that doesn't necessarily overly punitive to essential use, right? And so that's the only reason I'm showing you this chart in particular is just to validate. It looks like that 12,000 and 24,000 band is appropriate.
Okay.
If we compare this to these types of pricing structures that are used elsewhere, this looks consistent, okay? We will provide you the charts for the highest, the summer month. It does, all these blue lines flatten and cascade way out to the right. It does, so they are paying for it in the higher tier structure. This winter usage, it says 93% of accounts are falling below that threshold. It's actually pretty consistent as well with the gallons. It's like 8% of the gallons during the winter quarter are charged at the third tier rate. So it's very close. Just the winter quarter though. If we go out into the summer, it's gonna be more like 50%.
See that, it would be great to have a chart that included that information, because I think we do need to get that out to the community. And then as I look at, way out at 60, I mean, could that be someone had a busted pipe or something and all this, I mean, I don't know how much that little tiny bar represents.
They're not gonna be individual accounts, but they're gonna be close to, 2 to 3 or something to that regard.
Okay.
Any other questions on this in particular? So the structure does do the same thing for commercial users. Commercial use is not going to fluctuate as much seasonally. It will to some degree. In some cases, it might even go the opposite direction. It really depends on the individual business and what they're using the water for. Are folks, inside using the bathrooms, or are they, outside or, able to use the exterior of the building, things like that. But we do, still have this kind of price sensitive, we want a price mechanism. If we're gonna have a consumption tier, we want to apply it to the commercial as well, similar to your policy. The decision on the commercial was to use a wider band Again, the decision or the recommendation for those wider bands was because we just wanted to map the existing usage and provide a benchmark to, when we impose this tier structure, now there's going to be a charge for exceeding these thresholds beyond what you're using already to conduct your business. We don't want to play necessarily winners and losers for individual businesses. Some businesses need that water use, other businesses don't necessarily rely on it. They'd have a much easier time curbing it. We do still want, though, there to be a threshold, and we want that threshold to provide at least some kind of indication. And so, you know, this one doesn't look as nice, like histogram from a typical distribution, but as you can see, quite a bit of the commercial consumers are in the lower categories, and there's really just kind of individual outliers that go well beyond that threshold. Things like the hospital, other types of places. I mean, they use quite a bit of water, but they also, might only have 1 meter, but they're, 1,000 people are being serviced there. So, anyway, it does still look fairly consistent, 57, so above the median, is being captured within that first tier band. The second tier band, not as great in terms of performing as the residential, but still making sure we're getting close to that kind of, that outlier 10 to 15% is paying a higher rate for their usage.
When would be an appropriate time to think about bumping that tier 2 one more thing to the right? So to get the 225,000 gallons, that might get us closer to 90%.
You can do that, we can do that anytime. We're looking for feedback now, but.
I think we want to go there. I don't know.
Well, that's,
Well,
yeah.
So I think
if
that's
it's
already-
residential, we drop off at 93%, I think, just for peril, I don't know
I
what
think
the
it comes
policy.
back to that slide you showed of who's paying for the water.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and that fit pretty nicely.
Well, we got about, so we
I'm
better
sorry.
get to the
I'm
end.
I'm babbling, okay. Another thing I'll skip ahead. Another thing we analyze is we just want to make sure that the meter charges, the fixed cost, the base fee, are at least covering a substantial portion of fixed costs. And it looks like it is, about 66% of fixed costs within the system. We're going to recommend that you continue and go slightly above on the water fund to 5.25%. Again, most of that driven by the fact that the CIP is much larger in the future. But that should stay at a consistent funding level to make sure that the fund is setting aside enough cash to pay for everything you need over the course of the next 10 years. And that 5.25% would be applied universally across the structure. So we're not recommending any change to the structure, moving the tiers, thinking of that, but really just thinking about a incremental increase across the board, both to the base fee as well as the volumetric charges. This is kind of what this is that target compared to actual cash. There's an outlier year there because we've got bond proceeds for the treatment plant. And that treatment plant is being constructed over multiple years, so it's not being spent all right away. But again, fairly consistent.
If the water fund is maintaining adequate reserves right now, and we don't expect too much more growth, why do we want to raise the rates?
Because the change in the water treatment plant cost, it's up at 31 million in 5 years, so it's.
The water treatment plant cost is only relevant to the southeast part of Edina, right?
It's multiple hearts in the system. If a plant goes down here, that's gonna supply water to a big portion of the city. So it's all interworking, so we can take one system, one heart offline and maintain it while the others provide water to the whole city. We see water from this treatment plant all the way down in Southdale, and it could be vice versa. So it's a mixing of waters and it's a system.
The suggestion is that regardless of where the water plant improvement takes place, the whole city pays for it.
It's a benefit to the
Every
environment. It's a
taxpayer pays
system-wide benefit, yeah.
Would we have the mechanisms to charge differently for different areas of the city?
If you want to get extremely messy, I wouldn't do that.
Hard to do.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so.
Well, I think it's a fair question though, when we get to the sewer.
Well, let's keep going here.
Yeah, sorry, so same type of analysis.
Everything you've plugged in here, as a thing, something we need to do involves sanitary sewer. And most of the sanitary sewer projects involve commercial.
Yeah, that's where the demand is.
Or multifamily.
That's the demand.
So if you're gonna suggest that we spread the sanitary sewer across every taxpayer, I wanna make sure we think that through, because all these capital improvement projects that I see here at the beginning of your presentation, South Trunk sanitary sewer improvements, Lincoln Londonderry sanitary sewer improvements, water
Yeah.
treatment.
The south one was in there.
Those
So
things
York?
are all multifamily or commercial related.
Yeah.
In those neighborhoods.
So York is gonna be paid by connection fees that are happening before the project. The south trunk is paid by user fees after the capital is invested, because we gotta unlock that area to get the connection fees. And Lincoln Londonderry is not even in these numbers. So one is paying for itself, the other one you have to do before it gets paid for with those connections in the future. And that's just based on geography of where it's located.
It would be really helpful, and I think we need this, to have a chart that shows how much is being paid by different customers, residential, multifamily, commercial, over the past few years, so that we can see, and because I have heard from more than one person that commercial did not see a rise in their rates. And I need to know what has been going on. It'd be great, actually, if we could have it for the last 10 years, so I could see what has been going on. And I know we introduced the tiers relatively recently, and so if it shows what happens before the tiers were put in and after, that would be super helpful, and it would be something that I could share with people who want to talk to me about this, and I really need that.
So something akin to that,
Thank you.
percentage use and percentage paid for, but over 10 years. So like that one chart we looked at, which is for 1 year.
I think
Right, because I don't know what the rate, and I've
But
been
that, I'm
told.
just asking, is that what you're looking for?
Yes, for
okay.
over, and I think it, is very basic and necessary.
I think if I may, I know we're running short on time, but I think what you're looking for is maybe take like a sample, hey, what's, a median user, and here's what they paid in 2015 based on the structure, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, right, 10 years.
I want to know what the
And-
rate per gallon,
Yeah.
how that has changed and shifted.
And here's the rate per gallon, here's what they paid on their bill, and how that has changed over time. Is that?
Well, I want to be able to compare residential, commercial, multifamily, all of that with the differential, so I can say, in 2021, commercial was paying this when they were using X amount. So maybe we're saying the same
The whole
thing.
category.
She
Yeah.
wants the whole category,
Right.
you're talking individual.
So,
Right.
like,
that's
no,
the
I don't
difference.
want like a little.
She
I
wants
wanna
that chart
see the
you had.
whole-
I see a
like
stack.
this chart.
She wants that.
I don't want to know yours.
I see a stack.
So it's not like the elephant, the classic, one person's touching the tail, the other's touching the ears. I want to see the whole thing,
Right.
so I know what I'm looking at.
So even if it was 10 charts, like this is
Yeah.
2023, what did 2020 look like? What did maybe not every year,
Well-
but a sample of years?
I need to know what the rate increase has been for the different categories.
Yeah, okay.
Are we beholden to only having 3 tiers, or could we introduce a 4th tier?
Absolutely. There are other communities that have a 4th tier, typically refer to it as the penalty tier. It's really an outlier price indicator.
If we looked at like residential, I'm thinking like over 40,000
Yeah.
or something, like just the way above.
Yeah, it is something that you could do within your ordinance and establish it.
One of the things that I kind of wrestle with is, and maybe you guys have got an answer to this in the chat, just giving this some thought, I would imagine. When you think about our growth over the last 5-6 years, it hasn't been single family. It's all been multifamily and commercial growth. And so, are we making sure that the growth that we've had, those folks that are involved in the growth, they're paying their fair share to maintain our town. Because they're the ones that are precipitated, those are the projects that are precipitated some of the.
Right. We wanna make sure that, the connection fees
Yeah.
at the time of development are paying for
Right.
the growth, the infrastructure that is tied to growth and expanding the capacity of the system as a whole. And so that's why we recommended kind of changing. I think you were already kind of doing that, but we want to make sure we're mapping the portion of the CIP that is tied to those growth projects and make sure those fees are set to be able to cover those. And then, you know, the chart we showed with the different classes, you know, that's a test year in 23, it's just 1 year, but we are able to show that, you know, the charges are very closely tied to the actual usage with the system in place. But that's something that we can continue to monitor every time that this analysis is done, is go back and look at the most recent year or whatever and compile this data to look and put a set together to make sure that it's consistent. But that is a goal. And typically when we do analysis like this and we see there is a discrepancy, we'll probably recommend some kind of a change to an individual tier or an individual charge to try to make sure they can more closely align with one another.
But a lot of our improvement is needed just because of the age of the system, right? And so that, it's because of the age of our system. And so even if we didn't have any growth, I think there would still, I mean, we'd still need to do most of these projects.
Yeah, a big portion of them are just operations maintenance to keep the system working.
So when we come back and have more of this conversation, I think it'd be good for us to have a discussion on, like, what are our policy influences, or what are our, like, guiding principles as we're thinking about this? Because one is potentially conservation and how heavy we want to influence that, right? Because at the end of the day, I think some of these layers are going to be, you know, how much additional do we want to put into the capital improvement? But at the end of the day, if we're trying to, you know, raise X, there's not much flexibility in what the X is. It's more about how do we want to collect that money. And so I think that's where it's going to come down to the policy decision, is how do we want to appropriate that across the different populations, including the different tiers. And so I think that should be the discussion.
I have a whole bunch of questions we're not gonna
Yeah.
I have a whole list.
Come back and
Yeah.
have a follow-up. We're hoping to make some changes to the fee structure this year, by the end of the year, so if we would find another time, I guess
We
we
may
have
need to do a
look.
special, I think, with, given the volume of what's left to cover.
Yeah.
Well, much of the rest of the analysis is, I mean, it's in the slides, it's fairly consistent, you know, we're trying to hit a target, but we might want to talk about stormwater to some degree.
We should. Different time.
Would you also make sure that we all get this sent out as a PowerPoint in our emails with the list? We can download it and copy it.
It's in our packet, I think.
There is confusion because there was an earlier PowerPoint where the Ellers slides were identified as Ellers slides and there was more information. And so it would be really great if we could have that first presentation that got posted get back up there and then have this one as well, because this is just so confusing in terms of the content. And then to have one presentation that some people were looking at on Friday and then the presentation that is up right now, which is very, I think it's different. And I understand that it was pared down, but at the same time, I think we need both of those presentations online so people can see the contents. And I do appreciate, I mean, I get this format. However, for me, I really want to know what content is coming from Ellers. But I do appreciate that earlier presentation where there was more information. So.
Might I also add that we'll find date to come back, but we need to get something on the council for review for 26, 27 by the first meeting of December.
Yep.
And the second meeting in December for adoption per past practice. Okay, thank you.
water rates are
we
giving me
done?
a
We're
headache.
not adjourned.
All right, we're adjourned.
Yeah, it's like I have like a whole list of questions
Thank you,
Great
Ned.
information.
getting to.
Fabulous.
Fabulous.